All right, this is Josh Footer, UGA Extension, Cherokee County, and I'm going to cover an important step in the grafting process, which is post-grafting care. Um, Very important because you don't want to have done everything right and not put in just a little bit of attention here at this post-grafting portion and potentially risk losing some of your quality knife work. So just like if we're raising vegetable transplants, we know that hardening off period can be critical and can mean the difference between success or failure. So just like with our vegetable transplants, we want to harden these things off. In general, that's after the graft, leaving these in a cool, dark place with some moist soil around them. I like to just use my basement, and you can see these are pear grafts here, but it would be the same for apples. But just some damp soil in and around the roots, and leave these for 10 to 14 days if you can. That's going to allow that callus tissue to start to form around your graft underneath the parafilm. And while you're in this stage of hardening off your grafts, you can get a place ready for planting them. I like to grow them in sort of just a bed in my garden. If you're going to put them in pots, of course, you don't really have to be concerned too much about this stage. But we want to prepare a weed-free soil bed, well-drained soil. So if you have North Georgia kind of red clay soils, a good 2-3 inches of compost tilled in. If you need some lime, it's probably a little late to get a soil test and results back. But if you've been gardening in this area, you probably know where your pH is and where your nutrients are. So a good 2 to 3 inches of compost tilled in, and that's really going to make them, one, put on a great root system this first year, but also make them much easier to transplant when you do want to dig these up, in the following winter or fall, even on into early spring next year. So again, knowing that apples need that relatively neutral 6 to 6.5 pH, moderate fertility, you can get all this done while you're in that hardening off period. When we set them out, generally at least 18 inches on all sides. You can see this is a pretty wide row in my vegetable garden, so I kind of do a double planting here. So there's probably about 2 feet in between the rows, and then about 18 inches between the trees as they're set out. Personally, I use just 1 to 2 tablespoons of a slow release type of fertilizer, because I know that's going to be available to the plant for most of the growing season. Keep your labels, and we'll talk about this in the live Zoom and in some of our other recordings, but keep your labels. But if you're going to put out enough trees, I mean, even if it's just a handful of trees, I like to also have a map. You can see here, these are already set in the ground. We want to plant them about as deep as that first layer of roots. Some rootstocks may not have a ton of roots, so as long as we have that graft union well above the soil line, we should be fine. And I like to use just wood chip type mulch around my plants, and it helps a little bit with weed prevention. It's not great with weed prevention because I'm not using it 3-4 inches deep, but it does help retain that soil moisture. Here's an example of a planting map. So both with your grafting and your growing, but also when you permanently place these in your landscape or in your home orchard, always good to have redundant labels. All of those plant labels, something will happen to them. They will get lost, and you'll be left wondering what variety that was. So a map is always a good thing to have as a redundant backup. All right, so now we've planted them out and we're a couple weeks into this process. We want to just start monitoring for growth. What you're going to notice first, most likely, is you'll probably start to see buds breaking on the rootstock. Again, here's our rootstock. Most of the time, the rootstock, because it's had a head start, will start breaking buds and sending up shoots. We don't want to encourage those. However, I don't rub them off until I know that my graft was successful and my scion is starting to take off. That is because if that graft ends up being a failure, if I keep that rootstock alive, I can still use it again, either with a summer bud or just regraft it the same way we did this year, next winter time. So that rootstock growth is not desirable. However, you may want to delay rubbing out those buds again until you know your graft was successful. And that can be anywhere from 2 weeks after planting to a month and a half after planting. Some varieties will throw out flower clusters off of the scion, as hard as that is to believe. And as cool as it is to see, we do not want to encourage any of those flowers to open and just zap that young plant, that young scion of resources. So pinch those out just as soon as you can. You don't want to rub the entire bud out because the new shoot will come out from that same point of origin. So nail clippers, small scissors, or even just your fingernails, if your fingernails are long enough, we want to pinch these out. And around this time, I generally will do just a 2-bud graft. If you have 3 or 4, most likely all of them will start to develop shoots. And really the goal this year is to just grow a central leader, a single leader plant. So select one. Most of the time it's probably going to be the top placed bud. However, sometimes that one just grows at an off angle or something like that, so you may select the lower one. Here in this example, you can see I am just rubbing out the lower bud and going with the terminal bud on that scion. And sometimes, despite doing everything right, hopefully you'll learn a lot through this class and you will do everything right, but sometimes things happen and the graft fails. And you can see here, this is sort of what it looks like. You can see this variety I tried last year. Both of the same variety ended up being a failure, so I don't know if it was a problem with the scion. And you can see it's starting to brown. My rootstock is still alive, so again, I don't want to rush to rub those out because I was able to then go back in and at least save that rootstock. All right, important part here is, just about everything under the sun loves an apple tree, especially a young, tender growing apple tree. Birds in particular, they're not going to bother your trees as far as trying to eat them. However, they can, just flying by, land on that tender shoot, and that will break that tender shoot off at the scion. So here you'll see I kind of put distraction bamboo stakes around my plants. So if a bird does, happen to just fly by, hopefully they land on this bamboo stake, or they just see too much going on and they move on. Deer, the entire year will bother your plants and ruin either of them completely or slow you down at least a year worth of growth. Generally, I've had issues with mine later on in the season, and they'll nip those terminal buds. And at that point, sometimes you can lose up to a year's worth of growth and training and things like that. So have a plan for deer. Fence it off if you can. Repellents can help, but really exclusion is about the best way. Regular monitoring for insects and diseases, but I've never had much of an issue on my grafted trees. Most of the time, our summer cover sprays, are really about fruit quality. In general, these young plants, assuming we put them in full sun and are giving them regular water, they're probably going to just push right through and look really good for that first year. You may see some aphids, in which case, if you're just doing a handful of trees, probably the best way is get the water hose out and just blast them off with a spray of water. If not, maybe some insecticidal soap. Another thing that you may find is later on in the summer, as these things start to grow, especially with summer thunderstorms and wind, you may want to have a permanent stake. I like thin rebar. It's easy to stick in the ground and pull back out. So you may want to place a piece of rebar right next to your tree and have a way to safely and softly secure it to that upright support structure, just to keep that young whip upright. Again, so you're encouraging upright growth, but also you're not potentially risking that graft still breaking because of a windstorm or something like that. And so, well into summer, we've done everything right. We've got successful grafts. This is the growth that you can and hopefully should expect. You can see here just 2 months into the graft season. This is my helper Graham. So we weren't even in July and these things are already pushing 3 feet tall. By the end of the season, not unreasonable to expect a 6 to 8 foot tall tree. You may see some feathering, and that's just a funny term for branching. But really that's sometimes not ideal because, that thing's putting those branches at intervals maybe that aren't desirable for you where you're going to grow them permanently. So as long as you're getting a nice whip or central leader, you can then do a heading cut when you plant these out and get your first level of scaffolds and begin that training process next year. So congratulations if you've made it to this point. Your grafts are successful. You have grown your own apple tree, and during this time of year, that midsummer time, this would also be a good time to start figuring out where you're going to place them permanently, doing your soil tests, maybe making those pH amendments and getting that area ready so you can then pop these trees out of the ground in the wintertime. On young trees, you'll probably notice that they will tend to hold on to their leaves longer than more mature trees. So, I'm usually not digging up any trees until at least after Thanksgiving. It's pretty remarkable how well those leaves hold on even after a few light frosts. So